All right, so I just sent out the agenda. I'm sure if there will be anybody else joining, they'll trickle in. But I met with Lydia, and she wanted to, spend some time in this meeting talking about um our resource survey because we've discussed it a bit in that Article 85 conversation we've been having, and if there was time for it to talk about his cultural districts. Um, so Jennifer Gogler's here, and she's the architectural historian in the Office of Historic Preservation. Dorothy Clark is here. She is the assistant survey director. And oh, there's Lydia. And we have actually started this conversation, or are going to start this conversation internally. And they have volunteered to come and engage in the conversation. So I see Jen just unmuted herself, so I'll
I
let
just
her.
wanted to say Chelsea's here too, as well,
Yeah.
Hi,
staff
Yes.
architect.
Yes.
I'm here.
Um, yeah, so um, I guess I can pull up
Hi,
the
welcome. Hi, welcome. Okay.
I guess I can pull up the survey that we worked on the Article 85 memo just to start a conversation about it, and then we can talk more a little bit more in depth about um, what it should look like, and maybe we can look at some of the stuff that you provided, Jen. So I will let me find this memo and then I'll share it and we can talk about it a little bit more.
And I say the minutes that you sent,
Mhm.
what day do you think, or when relatively did you send them?
I sent them at least a week ago when I sent the invitation to this meeting
Okay.
via email.
I just want to look, I can look them over so that we can get them over with.
Worries. We can do that at the end if anything. So this started with this Article 85 memo, and Chelsea uh, created this sample survey. I don't know what's called. It is a budget, but it's more thorough than that, a plan. And some things that she included in there was a full-time position for survey and GIS, like a project manager specifically, and that person would help Dorothy, and that they would do a lot of upkeep um, of maps that are online, and anything that would come with the GIS required to maintain a survey, a citywide survey. She said that there should be a $6 million budget over 5 years to pay consultants. Um, she just put in order, it's alphabetical, these neighborhoods. Um, but we can talk more about based on previous surveys and need, which one would theoretically should be first. And then survey updating would be every 5 years by staff. And then I'll just go through this again quickly. Our focus was on the LA citywide survey because they used arches. It was really comprehensive, and their like product, like what you can engage with as a person who's just interested in looking at their survey, is really robust. Um, so she talks about arches. It's open source data management. It's free. I think it's the Getty Institute.
Mhm.
Um, and then Chelsea included service providers that would help. It would upload the survey onto Arches. And she put some stuff here. And then survey content, she wrote that the citywide survey will employ updates to existing building inventory forms, new area forms, new typology forms, and new building inventory forms. It'll be crucial that we develop a strategy of using different types of forms in order to capture all areas of our neighborhoods. It will be done via the typology forms and area forms, such as the ones created by C. Dempsey. And we
And
got
actually, can I just add to that? Because I know Lynn had concerns about that, but
Mhm.
MHC has actually accepted all of their types of forms. So
Okay.
that's not a concern anymore.
Okay.
Um, they they did a lot of work in Medford that was accepted by MHC. And that doesn't mean that's the only type that we could use, but it's a starting point because they're forms that can cover like many streets at a time.
Mhm.
which we will need if we want to be comprehensive. So just a little note. I forgot to answer her comment.
No, that's fine. So I'll go back here.
Would
I
it
don't,
cover anything besides buildings?
It can, and I think we're interested in the work that the Arts Commission has already done and sort of like merging our work, and it can be anything we want it to be. It can be cultural resources as well as, I don't know, monuments, landscapes, mile markers, that type of thing. So yes, the answer is yes.
yeah. So can you guys still see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. I don't know how to stop sharing my screen. It won't let me. That's so weird. Okay, so that's what we have, and I wanted to open the discussion up to the people, the BLC staff, because they know a little bit more about this than I do. And maybe if you guys want, I can share any of the presentations that you sent, and just let me know.
I can jump in, Hennessy, if that's okay. I have like two quick things to add to the conversation. One is in response to what Lydia just asked. I think Gabby's the one who pointed this out originally to us, but San Francisco is doing a really interesting project where they are looking at cultural resources as well, such as they say like oral traditions, festivals, crafts, etc. So, it just could be interesting to look at that. And then the other thing I was going to say was, and can I share my screen, Hennessy? Is that okay?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Just so this group is aware, and sorry if you've already talked about this before, but here. So we had some really wonderful volunteers come in this past fall from Wentworth, and they kind of looked at all the survey work that has been done over the years and mapped it, and it like labeled it by year. And so it was super interesting to look at what hasn't ever been covered. We should say that this is like kind of misleading, of course, because they're mapped as these like homogeneous zones, when in reality, just because something was within a certain boundary, certain areas are more focused on than others. So, this isn't like necessarily maybe the best way to represent it, but it was super helpful for us to just kind of look and see like certain corridors through the city that have never been surveyed. And just like if I go through it, you can see it kind of goes like neighborhood by neighborhood as well. So yeah, I just wanted to like let you know that we have this as like a reference. That's it. Thank you. Oops. Yeah, I'm also trying to stop sharing. Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
like we pointed out last time, like I just chose neighborhoods by what was listed on the city website as neighborhoods, kind of alphabetically, and that makes sense in terms of how the city sees things, but it might not make sense in terms of what has already been surveyed. So obviously there would be like a lot of work on where to start, and probably in areas that have not been surveyed as of yet.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm trying to find yeah, so what it showed was that Dorchester, Mattapan, their most recent one was in 2006. Austin Brighton was 1995. The Central Business District was 2012. Theater District was 1979. Hyde Park was 1980. South Boston was 1981. Jamaica Plain 1982. Fenway 1983. A lot of these were in the 80s. Like Charlestown was also in the 80s. North End's most recent one was 2015. Roxbury was 2018. West Roxbury was 88. Rosendale was also in 88. East Boston obviously is one of the most recent ones, which is happening this year and last year. South End was in 1990. Chinatown was 96. They have one for Washington Street, which was 1997, and Beacon Hill was 2000. So we could theoretically, based on when these were completed, we could prioritize the neighborhoods that haven't gotten an updated survey since the 2000s, even, you know, since the new millennium, right? Um, and another thing that I had a question about was how, you know, thorough these surveys are, and how much they cover.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Dorothy.
Dorothy.
When did you say Roslindale was done? I think you
88,
said that.
in
Yeah,
1988.
and that was like barely done.
Mhm.
So right now, the last couple of was it 23, 24, and going into 25. It's the East Boston neighborhood update. And the
Mhm.
last time that had been done was,
88.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. So we're rolling through there again, but we need to get to the others, and we're planning to have a look at Roslindale for the FY25 Survey and Planning Grant. So,
That's so that we can sort of catch up with squares and streets.
right.
initiative. So,
Oh,
and the other thing that I would say in what we found with, like for instance, when we looked at what was recently done in East Boston, it's not everything, and it's not really using the type of surveys that would be able to catch everything. So there are a couple area forms, but there's still a lot of individual forms that got updated, and I think we, except for, you know, very important things, very significant things, I think we need to sort of throw out the idea that we could touch everything on an individual basis, because we can't. And the reason LA was a really good example is because they do treat like what they consider the most high priority things with individual surveys, but then they use these like larger group surveys quite extensively as well. Sorry, that took me a long time to say that. The other thing I just want to note is that this budget is
Mhm.
like sort of a creation of kind of, I don't know, I think I'd call it like the worst case scenario, which I think we need to forecast. I sort of privately asked certain people who do this work, certain firms, certain individuals, and I got like wildly different numbers for kind of attacking a survey like this. So I'm aiming at the highest number I was given, and I added some to that because in the first year of doing this, we are going to need to hire one of these service providers who will help us get everything formatted and up onto a website which either they host or we host. And we had some initial quotes for that type of service as well. So this like very round $6 million number is, I think it's a good estimate. We could certainly hone in on it a little bit more. But I think the city needs to know that like this is going to be expensive. It's going to take a long time. And we're going to need help with funding, obviously. And maybe the planning department should be kicking in some of their extensive resources.
I think it makes sense to be conservative with those kinds of numbers, and by conservative, I mean, um, plan for, plan plan conservatively, expect that things are not going to be magically better than we hope that they will be.
Right.
And also, building in a cost escalation. So that if we do it next year, it might be 6 million. If we do it in 5 years, it might be 8.
Sure,
Mhm.
yeah,
Um,
a good point.
so.
A good one.
Yeah, and you know, when we think about what this will give the city in terms of like an understanding of what we have, I, I really don't think that this is an unreasonable type of number. But you know, I've only worked here for 2.5 years, so if anyone wants to burst my bubble, feel free.
Okay, I have another question about the survey that you have done on East Boston. I know that it was broken into phases. What is like prioritized in these surveys? What are you trying to capture when you do these surveys so that we have a baseline understanding?
Well, it's an update.
Mhm.
So for the most part, it's looking at areas that have already been looked at, properties that
Mhm.
may not have the data sheets. So those are being created and added to Macris.
Mhm.
But I look at it as a kind of rolling thing, like we rolled into East Boston in 89 and now we're rolling back there because between 89 and uh what year was that? 2023,
Mhm.
there were other areas of the city done. Definitely not enough other areas in the city done, but
Okay, I see.
so
So
as for
basically,
prioritizing,
mhm.
no, well, like Chelsea just said, I've only been here like 2.5 years. So, um, I am not aware of the strategy
Mhm.
that was developed when this was set out. So I inherited the first go around in East Boston. And since we were there, I just kept going instead of hopping around to different areas of the city.
I think it's also worth noting that these like very small amounts of money that we get for the
Oh.
grants are like they're kind of pitiful in terms, it's not that like we don't appreciate them and that we don't put them to best use. We do. But when we looked at when we just looked at the East Boston stuff together, Jen, Dorothy, and I, we were amazed at how little of an area gets done for
Mhm.
$35,000. And
Oh,
that's, you know, the
yeah.
cost of the reports. I mean, the cost of the survey work has gone up, but the grant
Mhm.
money hasn't. So that's why we're, you know, if we're serious about this and if the city is serious about this, we need to be looking at like a $6 million number instead of a $35,000 number a year.
Mhm.
I hope
Mhm.
that makes sense.
Yes, because the last survey completed, the FY23, there were properties that, due to time constraints and budget restraints, could not be done. So we had leftover at least 72 properties that could use documentation. So that's what I've put in the request for MHC funding for FY25.
Right. It's just a very different type of project than what we're talking about with this like large thing, this
Mhm.
proposed large thing.
And do
So
you guys
is
think
the
that
large thing something that would give the city, I don't even know if this terminology is even used anymore, sort of a windshield survey level of literally traveling every street in the city, identifying in a quick visual assessment those potential assets that should be further documented. And so it would give us that baseline, and then it would give us that additional documentation, or would it just give us the baseline? And is there a sort of layers of the onion where we start with the commercial streets within our neighborhoods and then go out into the residential districts? Or, you know, is there a strategy mapped out for
I
some of
think
that work?
That's such a good question. And I think that, you know, it's sort of it's what we want it to be. But I think that you're right that the first 5 years would be more of a windshield this listing, and that would help us identify what needs to be updated, you know, on the rolling cycle of this, like every 5 years, we have to hit these areas. And I'll give you an example of why this is a good thing. And that is this week we heard of a new development that's being proposed, already got their ZBA approval, and it will affect 2 houses from the 1800s and one that potentially was inhabited at some point by Joseph Warren, you know, Dr. Joseph Warren. And so, like, if we were doing the windshield study of that street, we'd say, okay, there are 18, you know, square plan, I don't know, whatever kind of houses on a street. But of note is this one property that has a historic graveyard, a historic, you know, an 1800s house, a barn in the back. And so that would get a higher, that would get like when we talk about doing like a red, yellow, green rating system, or a 1, 2, 3, 4 rating system, you know, that would get a number 1 immediately, just because we can date the buildings quickly. But at the moment, we don't have that. And it doesn't, it like doesn't relate to the other things that we have. Like Macris is good, but it's only as good as what has been filed. And so having that like large scale survey will help Boston understand what they have.
Could I jump on that, Chelsea, to also say it's not, when we're talking about going through and looking at the whole neighborhood, and, you know, it's not like inventorying everything from scratch, right? Because if a building hasn't really changed much since the 80s, like the building inventory form could still be useful. What we're finding a lot of the times is the existing survey ratings are just seem out of whack to us. Like they're often too low. And we're doing a lot of survey rating upgrades lately. And Kathy and I were just talking about this. And we're like, you know, part of this would be not to like redocument every single building, but to like look at it with today's eyes and in today's context and say, like, no, that's rating level 3 local significance, not 4 or 5, you know, and that has implications because that affects what petitions we can accept for landmarking. So it's a little bit, I think it would be assessing what we already have, filling in the gaps of things that weren't documented but need to be, and also looking at what was documented but needs like a review of its rating or a new photograph or something like that.
Okay, so if I'm summarizing correctly, the survey would be useful if we revamp the rating system, assess what we have in terms of that rating system, and also its importance to today, and then being able to survey what we don't have. Okay, great. And then, you know, if we're talking historic and cultural resources, how could we see cultural resources fitting into that survey? What, you know, what would be a good way to measure something like that? If I like, if okay, I'm so sorry. If it's like statues, that's one thing, right? But is there something else that's intangible, tangible that we could include in that? cultural resources aspect of it. Maybe not a question we can answer yet.
Well, I guess a
Sorry.
question, and maybe Chelsea, maybe you know, Arches, which is what we're talking about possibly using, is a GIS-based system, right? So it's tied to a location,
Yes.
as far as I understand. So it's easier if you imagine something that can be associated with an address. It's a little harder if there isn't a geographic location, but you know, maybe we find a way. Like maybe we talk to San Francisco. I'm curious how they're doing it.
I think the other thing that I'm finding challenging is I sort of understand how a visual assessment gets done,
Mhm.
but I'm not as clear how you get information efficiently. You know, what's the equivalent of a windshield survey for the cultural history of Boston? So there might be a physical place that's hugely important in terms of cultural history, that is not as visually distinctive as another property. So you might find something that is, you know, you think of Dean Street, you think of the home of Malcolm X. If you don't have that information, the building itself is like many other buildings. Is that fair, Dorothy?
Okay,
Sorry, you're
this is
muted.
here for what, you know? Whoops.
Yeah,
Yes, I'm unmuted. Okay.
no,
Yeah, so it does need the story to go along with it. And I think that's a lot, or should be a lot, of historic preservation. What's the story to this? Why is this, why should people look upon this as being something that is significant?
Yeah, I think that it's so wonderful that we can use Arches because there's no limit to what you can input there. For instance, like, okay, we have a section of Dorchester that we call Little Saigon. So not only can the addresses be mapped and like geolocated, but there can be like a whole, you know, there can be an overlay of Little Saigon. There could be 18 overlays in one part of Dorchester, but that's for us and people who study things like this. Like I'm thinking about the class that you were working with, Lydia, in Chinatown, where I went to their presentations. Like, you know, all of that information could be input by the students, you know, under, I guess, our supervision. So I think Arches is really good for this.
I'm just trying to understand from a budget perspective, how do we budget for outreach to a broad range of communities to ensure that we are, like, how do you find those stories? For example, if you arrived in Boston and had never heard the term Little Saigon, how would you do a comprehensive survey that included that? So how do we improve the information available as opposed to document the information, improve the documentation of the information that we already have? Again, totally on board with improving the documentation, but I just want to make sure when we budget $6 million, by the time you're asking for $6 million, if what you actually need is 7, so I think that was just in terms of the scoping of the project. I wasn't clear where that cultural and social history and the human history piece of it is inventoried the way the architectural history piece of it can be evaluated by a trained professional relatively efficiently. At least in a, that's worth looking at, that's close, that, you know, you don't, I don't know how to better say what I'm aiming for, I'm sorry. But I really am thinking about how do we use this as an opportunity to get a better grasp on not just the visual history and the architectural history, but the social and the human history of the city?
Yes, it's going to take more time. It's going to take more digging. Or should I say a
If we
different kind of time?
Yeah, but
Because with
if
the
we keep the budget running, then we can always have the money to do that. And we can always have the money to pull
I'm
in.
just trying to understand if that's accounted for in the budget number that, in the draft budget number that's been prepared.
Mm-hmm.
It may not be. And honestly, as you talk about this, of course, I'm thinking about, you know, the MAPC and how they do cultural plan, like cultural
Mhm.
mapping, cultural asset mapping, and their work with arts and culture. That might be a good start into seeing, you know, if MAPC and arts and culture are working together to create some kind of asset mapping. How did they do that? What did it take them? How long will this take them? What will it cost them? And that way we
And do
can,
they wanna, like, do they wanna collaborate? Like, do they wanna come in
right,
and give our new staff person all of their data so that we can get it on to our survey? And I
right,
think, sorry, in terms of a rolling budget, I think that staff position is one example of how it keeps getting updated. But I think now that I'm thinking about it, you're probably right that we need a certain amount of budget per year to do these types of improvements and updates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But Margaret, you're probably right that this is somewhat problematic from the get-go because it's based on whatever it's based on, parcels or however we decide to do it. And that doesn't necessarily have to be how we start. Maybe, I don't know, Jen, if you have any thoughts on what's been done before. I think we have to start somewhere. So that's, but it doesn't mean it has to be limited just to like our purview. And you
Right.
know, many associations that use arches are actually not doing buildings. They're doing artifacts or forest canopy or things like that.
And
So
we talked about using arches, what was it, early from like 2023 into 2024. So we didn't get to do a really deep dive into it, but we got an understanding of what was possible with it. We just
I think
yeah,
the tool sounds excellent. I'm just trying to figure out, if we have adequately provided for what it takes to feed the data into the tool. And, you know, artifacts, tree canopy, buildings, even, you know, physical places are all visual items that can be assessed through a similar mechanism. What I'm curious about is how do we how does one even begin to start the exercise of of doing an inventory of where important things in Boston have happened and defining important as beyond, you know, revolutionary period battles. It's
Yeah.
it's not that I'm saying you should know the answer. I'm just saying I'm trying to visualize or understand, like, how do you even start that
Yeah,
crowdsourcing? Exactly.
I don't think it, I don't see it as a big of an issue because there are tools out there that track where photos are taken. And
yeah.
if you go and see, hey, this is Carnival that's happening in Forest Park. Well,
Mhm.
okay, oh, hey, now this is Night Market that's happening in Night Market on Dorchester Avenue for Boston Little Saigon, or this is the St. Patrick's Day Parade. I think that the joys of social media is that lots of that will just flare up. So and there's
Yeah.
no way you can tackle all of it all at once. So you'll get the big ones, and then once you get those done, you can move on to the next level, the next level, the next level.
And
Yeah,
that
and I
sounds
think
like a really interesting strategy. I just want to make sure that we're planning and
Prepared.
budgeting for it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The consultant that I talked to at, I forget the name of the company. It's sort of a boring name. It's in this document, but they actually asked me like how much crowdsourcing we were going to do. And so I think that I think we can prepare for it. And we just have to know when to like turn it on and turn it off. Like I think it has to be open for public comment during like certain months of the year or whatever, and then like maybe stem the flow a little bit so that we can deal with all the information. Maybe on a quarterly basis or something like that.
And I also think organizations like the Boston Preservation Alliance and similar places throughout the city could also be huge resources for things like this.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think,
well,
yeah, again, like, I think, sorry, Hennessy. I
no
don't know why
worries.
I talk so much. I'm really sorry. I haven't seen another adult all day.
No.
I just wanted, I do think that like we have to get the city to say, yeah, we're going to do this, or yeah, we know this is important. We're going to try to do this. And then it's kind of it's our job to make sure it gets done correctly. And I think that you're right, Margaret, that we haven't thought of all of it yet. That's true.
But somebody said the word collaboration a little earlier, and that piece is extremely important, not just with uh, other city agencies, but with the people who live in the various parts of the city. And what this makes me think of is getting people engaged, which can be a major project sometimes, but we've got something brewing now with a petition for an area. And the amount of interest that looking into this area and drafting this petition and everyone searching the history of their houses has really ballooned. People are very excited about doing this work. They don't know how to do it, but they are happy to go along with someone who does know how to do it, and they're finding it thrilling. So it's one of those things, like you sort of said, crowdsourced. Um,
Right.
I see that as possibly a piece of that. But people who just live where they live uh, can become interested in, well, who lived here before me? What was here?
Mhm.
So it's interesting that San Francisco apparently has a form that people can fill out that feeds into Arches. So I just linked to that in the chat, and we could take a look at that as an example. But I think it should be crowdsourced and coming from the communities, but I also think we need to fund and staff, the oversight of this. Like, it's not like we're just going to put out this link and it's just going to run itself. So I think Margaret has a good point that, just making sure that the upkeep of this is similarly budgeted for after those 5 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. While we were having this discussion, I was looking into what arts and culture really does with their surveys. And I found some interesting things. They're doing something with the waterfront right now, which I will send. I will also send um, this is the Chinatown plan that obviously my groups in Chinatown worked on with NYPC and arts and culture and if I'm not mistaken. And then I also found maybe really random, but so this is what I'm about to send is a like presentation of their final recommendations for waterfront civic cultural space planning, which they did in collaboration with the planning department. And then I'm also sending one from 2005 maybe I'm flooding you guys with information, but this is a study of cultural, civic, and nonprofit facilities of public accommodation.
Mhm.
And I think the question is, if, let's say, the arts and culture is doing this kind of cultural planning and they're mapping out spaces, well, I won't say buildings, but spaces for use and for upkeep of cultural of a heritage of a neighborhood. I think the question is that what we are trying to make sure is addressed if it's the building that hosts these cultural, importance, or if there's something more. Yeah, I don't know if I'm explaining what I'm trying to say appropriately, but I'm just wondering if what arts and culture does in terms of their cultural planning is what we're envisioning, and if it's enough, um, and if it's properly inventorying what we would like to see. Because if it is, then we can talk with them and work through how they do their processes. Um, and that can lead to some different kinds of budget discussion if we're collaborating with them in that regard, versus if what they do and how they do what they do is not exactly what we're looking for, then it's a separate conversation about what our budget needs to look like.
Mm.
And what when we say cultural heritage, what we are aiming for, so that it's not overlapping or redundant.
Mhm.
Well, I think it can be, I mean, except for like data entry, it's okay if it's redundant, in a way. Like, it's okay that they already did this report on like civic spaces that people can use.
Mhm.
I don't see a problem with that. I just see a problem with like making sure that we first hit the ground running and like with a comprehensive product.
Mhm.
Because we can, I mean, according to the people that I talk to, like it's just endless. You can add to Arches forever, as long as long as the city will host it, or we pay to have it hosted. You can make it as big as you want it to be.
Mhm.
I think it will take a considerable amount of effort just to host to data entry and host the
Ooh.
architectural resources. So
Mhm.
and I do get back to the idea that like we're trying to improve Article 85. And so not that that can't be linked to cultural resources, but oftentimes it is a building or a property that we're talking about.
Mhm.
Right, I just have lived here long enough that I have heard a lot of stories of um buildings that were demolished because they weren't architecturally compelling, but had a profound role in the history of certain communities in Boston. And so I totally agree that it's tied to a place and it's tied to an age, but it's just that different state,
Mm.
in terms of,
Yeah.
the purposes of landmarking something.
Mhm.
It's a huge discussion for us too, because preservation is beyond bricks and mortar.
Mhm.
It can be anything from the smell of cannoli on the streets in the North End, or it's
Mhm.
like they call it intangible preservation.
Right.
But even the tangible preservation of, the demolition of all the buildings along Melnia Cass. And
Mm-hmm.
the vibrance of that community and what it lost in that urban renewal
You didn't call me.
time.
Hmm?
I'm
Yep,
Sorry,
sorry.
sorry. I'm talking to my husband.
So I think, I think that there are lots of really good opportunities. I just, again, sorry, it comes from working in the Treasury Department. I keep coming back to, budgeting adequately, and being really clear about if we want to do this work, this is what it takes to do well. And the real intention that I think exists in the 250th, 300th anniversary, that is about telling a broader story,
Mhm.
and really being intentional about that. There may be things that even just in collaboration, there are a ton of resources out there. I'm looking at, I added to the chat, the BPL project of digitizing community history.
Yes.
But even capturing that and going through that and seeing, are there physical addresses that people are talking about in these community histories that should be tied in? You know, what's the Jewish history of Franklin Park? What's the Irish history of Franklin Park? What's the Black history of Franklin Park? It has meaning for all of those communities.
Yes.
About places of assembly, places of association, that is not at all the physical history of it. So again, I'm just talking budget at this point.
Uh-huh.
No, I agree. I'm using, since we brought up Malcolm X, Intervale Street. There are no pending petitions on Intervale Street, but two houses on two of the locations on Intervale Street. I point over here because I live right down the street. Um, one is a mosque where he gave sermon, and it's the same mosque that he and Louis Farrakhan, who controversial figure but historic nonetheless, were part of and were leading. And then Louis Farrakhan's house is right next door, and I think it's like 23, 24 Intervale Street. Not those buildings, maybe not particularly architecturally interesting. I might disagree. I think Roxbury is a nice. I live in a nice area architecturally, but those are significant buildings for the histories, for what they're associated, who they're associated with, but they're not necessarily on the BLC's radar unless right, that this is something that happened on that street. So it's a great point, and it is something that if no one knows about it and someone's like, I want to demolish it, and it slips under the radar because we don't have enough information about the personage, not necessarily the architectural significance, then we lose it. So I think it's a great point. It is something separate, potentially, from what like arts and culture are trying to, capture in the kind of planning that they do, but still something equally intangible in the loss of fabric of a community.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree. I do think that we have a need to flesh out the budget a bit more, and flesh out what exactly we are trying to get into when we talk about this like survey plan that we have, because it's not just right now, it's just we want to survey neighborhood alphabetical order budget, but realistically it needs to move around so that it's these neighborhoods haven't been surveyed in a long time, and also have X, Y, and Z amount of Article 5 applications, for example. So we see a need to update there, and then so that we know what's there in terms of buildings. Great. And then we also need to update the ratings that we give them in terms of their significance. And we also need to budget for or potentially create programs where maybe like an internship or something so that people get that experience and whatever, where we do that kind of research about personage and heritage, at the very least, what a place means to a history of people that are important in their community.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
oh, sorry, go ahead, Dorothy.
Well, this makes me think of, and I really only learned this in like the last year, of how the spirit, the feel of a neighborhood changes. So I'm thinking about the Washington Street corridor from approximately Eggleston Square to Forest Hills, which was once extremely residential. And then it became not so because houses were torn down, sort of businesses were put up, gas stations were put in the area, car washes, laundromats, the bus yard. Now, some of these houses were moved to side streets. Finding the records about those would be require a bit of digging. But it's interesting how Washington Street, with its L, changed from highly residential to this kind of industrial looking neighborhood. The gas company building moved over here, which is now the high school. So it's interesting to be able to chart how things move back and forth like that. Now this particular corridor is becoming like really big for high-rise buildings, and it kind of reminds you of having the L back up there. So it's kind of dark. It's getting dark on Washington Street.
So
I
I
think
think that it's
our-
worth noting that 2 of the 4 criteria for listing a landmark for the city of Boston are related to history that can't be identified visually in a
Mm.
visual assessment of a structure. And so I think that we have to plan for how do we address a resource at which events occurred that made an outstanding contribution to and are identified prominently with, or which best represent some important aspect of cultural, political, economic, military, or social history. And criteria 3, a resource associated significantly with the lives of outstanding historic personages. I think, we're super strong on criteria 4, the architectural, or landscape design or craftsmanship, with distinctive characteristics. And criteria 1 is listing on the National Register, so that's taken care of. But I think we are strongest in terms of our plan and our budget for criteria 4. I think we want to put some more resources to bear for criteria 2 or 3, because I think at the moment, Boston's landmarks are not equally distributed amongst those 3 forms. They may be, I may be wrong.
No, I think that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Okay,
and I think
so
we also can, when we say this is going to be done by consultants, I mean, it's our scope of work that we need them to fulfill. And so we can be asking for more than we usually ask for, or we can be asking for things differently than we usually ask for.
Mhm.
And I think that's probably technically how we answer this question. And then we also answer it by adding sort of a yearly upkeep budget or something like that,
Mhm.
in addition to the staff person.
Mhm.
okay. So we have a lot of editing to do. We have keeping in mind that it's 3, we have one more thing on our agenda, which was the cultural districts intro discussion. And we talked a little bit about cultural districts and how they might now, I mentioned that they might be a useful resource in looking at what they are, what they value, what they are preserving. I looked on the Mass Cultural Council website because they're the ones who oversee and help with cultural districts. And they actually have paused the program for this fiscal year because they're reviewing and redesigning their program, which I thought was very interesting.
Mhm.
Just putting that out, just putting that out there. But you know, we had mentioned in the past that we, you know, cultural districts are a state legislation. We wanted to see what cultural districts really did for a community, what they boosted for a community, and if there was a way to strengthen them, what that might look like.
Mhm.
And what it might mean for these conversations around surveying, um, to really give cultural districts a seat
I
at the
think when,
table. Because
when MAPC started looking into this question, two of the most interesting examples were San Francisco and also the state of Illinois legislated a kind of cultural district. And it was largely at the initiative of the Puerto Rican community.
mhm,
Yeah, so
Mhm.
both of those were kind of interesting examples.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
but we just need to look at some case studies and because I mean, I remember the Latin Quarter. I was like 15 at the time, and I was working at High Square Task Force, which is obviously, you know, heart of Jamaica Plain, and I was like, sign this petition, you know. So I do remember like the work that was done to make it the Latin Quarter. I do wonder now what, if anything, they feel a benefit, you know, like what benefit they feel comes out of this, if they feel like they have more foot traffic
Uh,
from visitors, if they feel like, you know, their cultural institutions are more protected. Like, I would be interested to know how people feel that having a cultural district has
Mhm.
impacted them in any way.
Mhm.
I mean, a lot of what I hear, like the Latin Quarter and the Little Saigon, is that it's mostly about recognition,
Mhm.
and so that there may be some marketing benefit, but it's not like it doesn't provide any particular protection or nor a lot of resources.
Right.
Mhm. Yeah, I wonder if there's, you know, some collaboration for the historic preservation office to explore with cultural districts and potential landmark areas.
Mhm.
Um, there's something there. I mean, everything costs
Is
money,
it?
right? You need new staff people and things like that. But I think it'd be worth a conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hennessy, isn't this kind of the type of thing that Gabby wants to get into in her new role? Um,
I hope so.
Yes. This is
I
part
think
of
it's
what
kind
it-
of her
Uh-huh.
aim. So we just introduced a new position that was actually open for a really long time. Because of our staffing issues. And I think, what is it called? The Preservation Project.
Preservation's
Preservation project
project
manager.
manager.
And I
Mhm.
think, and so one of our planners got the job, so she'll be moving to a new role, Gabriella Amore, and she has a lot of interest in this area. So I think that was kind of part of the job description as well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Okay.
So we can rope her
Yeah.
in.
Mhm. Yeah,
Mhm.
so when she starts the job, maybe we can invite her to
Yeah.
talk about her ideas there.
And I
Yeah,
think
oh,
cultural
yes.
districts might also be another hotspot, for lack of a better term, for inventory work.
Yep.
That if
Yes.
something has been identified as a cultural district, that may be an indicator that there is a need for um, inventory focus.
Yeah.
Yep, I think that's right.
That's a good point.
I like that phrase, inventory focus.
Mhm.
I do like that idea because I think that's kind of how the Jones Hill, Virginia Monadnock kind of surveying started off, because it was called like a arts district in like the early 2000s because of the Strand Theater, and then that
Oh,
just
that's
kind of
interesting.
highlighted everything else around it, became like
Mm.
more. It got a little bit of focus, so I don't really know if being called a cultural center with the Strand Theater has really helped the Strand Theater at all. But at least these other buildings now have gotten focus and attention, and stories have gotten told and shared and promoted that may not have done before.
Mhm.
Good point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
So keeping in mind it's 3:05. I think that there are some action items that have come out of this. Um, one is definitely to identify and update the budget. Identify what we're really trying to survey and update the budget accordingly. And to also really define the okay, great. Really define which neighborhoods need to be prioritized. And also, connect with the institutions that are doing some of this cultural work just to see how they might collaborate with us, and also see how we can you really highlight that those other criteria that are not architectural significance, and also look into how we might look at cultural districts and see what we can do for historic preservation in those areas.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Is there anything I missed?
No, I think you got it.
Okay. All right. So open it up, final comments, and then if not, we'll adjourn a little early.
This will require, a lot of talking through and a lot of thinking about. So hopefully this will be the first kind of, is there a deadline of some sort we need to be aware of for what we're doing here?
It's not. It's a good question.
Budget or Mhm.
Mhm. I mean, budget considerations. If I'm not mistaken, Margaret, the conversations are happening for a January deadline, right? If I'm
Mhm.
I think you're going to want to have, I think you're going to be doing a lot of talking and a lot of laying of groundwork.
Mhm.
Because the formal budget discussions usually are late fall.
Mhm.
You don't want to surprise anybody with these kinds of numbers. So I think it's a really thoughtful, staff level initiative, up to the department heads with and the context of the committee, the commemoration committee is a really valuable way of framing that conversation. So why here, why now? Why should we be doing this today and not 10 years from now? I think it provides an opportunity to have those conversations. My take on it, and this is my personal take on it, is I would start having these conversations within your department, within your cabinet, sooner rather than later. And, again, leaning into the commemoration commission, as a forum where community members have said, we do not have this information. We have partial info. The information that we have is wonderful. We need to have equivalent information for more places and more kinds of stories than we do now. And it is our intention to do that. And this is what it takes to move that from intention to reality. Have those conversations in summer, queue it up for the fall budget conversations, and then see how much of it you can get in your budget request for the fiscal year that starts a year from July. So not this coming July, but a year from July. I will tell you, one-time costs are often easier to fund than ongoing costs. So to the extent that we can make it clear that a lot of this will be consulting services and that a large initial investment is required, but it is not we need to expand our resources for a short period of time, and then we need the ongoing maintenance staffing to keep it going. So getting that inventory up and done, initial public investment, and then maintaining it over the long term. Like a building, you build the building, it's very expensive, but then you just maintain it over time.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I want to add that I think that that aligns with the actual ordinance, which gives this group specifically the longest time, which is 18 months from when we begin meeting, which would be August 2025. So starting the conversation now, having that Article 5 memo, really fleshing out a memo for a potential survey undertaking, and then having that ready for, you know, starting these conversations internally, but then having that full report ready for that June, July time, not only like is in line with what we're supposed to be doing anyway, but might help with those, you know, fall conversations.
Right, so I would say we were tasked with looking at this specific regulatory framework. One of the things that was identified when we looked at what it would take to address this regulatory framework was a lack of base information. The base information is lacking both in the breadth of the information that we have citywide, in the depth about particular resources, and also over time has not been updated for 40 years in some cases. And so in order to implement the recommendations that we're making, that baseline information has to be available, accessible, organized, transparent, all of those great things, so that because changing that legislation without that baseline information, and Chelsea has made this point just brilliantly on several occasions, you're always playing catch up if you don't know what you're dealing with. And so to the extent that we, from a preservation perspective, from a history perspective, from a community perspective, can ensure that people coming in to build in our city or rebuild in our city understand the context that they're working in and understand the priorities of the city in protecting our shared history. I think that that's, if it were me, that's the context I would put it in.
Oh, that's great.
Almost like I've done this once or twice before.
I mean, it's almost like we could use this recording and paraphrase you. Thank you, Margaret.
Well, you all taught me a lot, so I'm hoping that I'm capturing some of that, but I think I think that there's a lot of good work, but in order to really implement the legislative and policy changes that we're talking about, that baseline information really has to be improved, and we have to get it to people earlier in the process so that it is a fairer, more transparent process for everybody involved.
Is this anything that external advocacy is beneficial for?
I think that talking it up and I think making it clear that it's not, and this sounds pejorative, and I'm sorry, it's not simply an academic exercise. It's not a nice to have, it's a need to have. As our city builds and changes, we need to have this information.
Yeah, and I think that we've, at least for us on a staff and new leadership level, we talk about the citywide survey as if it's already a thing. And we do it often, and we do it loudly, and we do it as much in front of our planning colleagues as we possibly can. And I think that that has started to take hold in the city, which is great. But we've been so, I think, annoying to people that they're like, okay, just, well, fine, we'll talk about it like it's a real thing. So that's good. And then, yes, Matthew, external advocacy will be needed once we start really like trying to get leadership buy-in, I think. In a
Alright.
nice
Ready.
Yeah, I
way.
agree.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think this was a nice way to wrap up.
Yeah.